Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody to the plein air watercolor journaling. I use watercolor and pen and ink. I've been doing this since 2003. I'm Don Taylor. I am a signature member of 17 watercolor societies, and I've been painting in watercolor for over 45 years. I would like to go ahead and show you a few of the things and talk about the plein air journaling, some of the things that you need to know and be aware of, and then I'll do a demonstration. My philosophy on this is that you have to do a 2-minute drawing, 30-minute max painting. And this is because you don't have that much time when you're traveling. You may be, the bus may be leaving, the boat may be leaving, you've got to work fast. This is not something that you can sit down there and do multiple sketches of trying to figure out what you're going to do. So you have to have in your mind quickly what you are going to do, and I'm going to try and show you how to do that today. First, let's look at some of the materials and things that you might need to have. First of all, this is a pack that I usually take. I might put it in a backpack, but just a little bag like this. You have things like a collapsible water bag. These are nice. They make collapsible water containers. In this case today, I'm just going to be using a cup. I use one of the bamboo brush holders. These are nice. You can always, if it takes up too much room, you can buy one of these and cut it off and shorten it to fit the brushes that you do have. These protect your brushes pretty well, keep them from getting crushed, and it doesn't take up much room. The journals that you use will be, you need 140-pound paper. And there's a number of them out here that you could use. I wouldn't particularly try to recommend a special one, but you need paper that's at least 140-pound paper. Don't use anything lighter than that. You need something to carry your tools and instruments in. In this case, I have just a retractable pencil. Ink pens, I like to use a Statler pigment liner anywhere from a 0.3 to a 0.5. This little item right here is something that you really need to have, some type of a clip, because when you are out working outside and painting, the wind is always blowing. I found this out the hard way. You need this clip to clip the page you're working on and several of the other pages together to keep that clip together, so that the pages don't start blowing on you when you've got wet pigment on the paper. Also, you see here that we have a folded over paper towel behind the sheet that you're working on. If you don't put that in there, you will very likely, as you spill paint over onto the next page, and you'll ruin the next page unnecessarily. So you want to make sure you have all this together and ready to go. And the rest of the bag I have here, you might have like an eraser, carry some rubber bands, extra pencils, and just about it. You know, you don't want to overload yourself, but you want to make sure you have enough here so you can keep it all together. So what we're going to do today is go ahead and start a demonstration, and I'm going to work from a plein air painting that I did in the journal in Germany, and I'm just going to use this because it's fairly simple, that we can do it quickly and show you exactly how this works. So we'll go ahead and change over here, and I'll start showing you how to do the demo. I also want to mention one other thing about traveling. Not long ago, we took a trip to the Budapest and Bucharest and the Black Sea, and they lost our luggage for 7 days, our checked luggage. Fortunately, I had my journal in my carry-on luggage, but all my paints, brushes, and everything else were in the check luggage. So here, part of what I was going for was to do my plein air journaling, and most of my stuff except the journal was gone. So I immediately, the first town we got into, I found an art store, found a pencil, a ink pen, and an eraser. And so for a week, I ended up doing nothing but pencil, pen, and ink drawings. And most of these, actually, this is good for when you really don't have much time. Almost all of these pencil and pen and ink drawings were done in 30 minutes or less. And so this is all this is from the Budapest to Bucharest. It was we were gone for a week before the luggage finally caught up with us. So we've got these are all of the things that you can do. This is one of my favorites here, the chain bridge in Budapest. So, anyway, be prepared. You know, if something happens like this, roll with the punches and go ahead and keep on producing. So, now before we get started, I want to show you some of what I use for a palette. We didn't get into that. This is just a very simple palette here. I have all the colors that I need in there. Some of them I don't use very much, but this has a place here where you can mix some of your paints. But I like to use this because I'm always rinsing my brush out, and you put a paper towel down there, you put your cup of water on top of it, because here again, you weight this down because the wind is going to blow all this away. So you always have to consider the wind when you're working. So I've got my palette ready to go. This is another good one that Winsor & Newton makes, and this is very tiny. You can see how small this is. This literally, if you want to pack really lightly, this really works very nicely. There's Shy's Art also makes a 3-wing palette, which is very nice. I don't have one of those right here to show you, but they make some little tiny palettes, and these are for somebody who really wants to travel light. Okay, so what we're going to do here, this is one that I did in Bernkastel, Germany, that's on the Mosel River. And I'm going to use this because it's fairly simple to do, and I'm going to show you how we're going to do a quick sketch. Actually, the hardest thing when you're doing this is to imagine in your mind where you want to place things on the paper, because you can't put everything in there that's in front of you. You have to leave some things out, and you have to make sure you get things started on the paper so that you don't have to keep erasing and moving it around. So you have to know where you want to put things. And basically, if you're looking at a scene, for example here, I'm using this as my center of interest, and I will place this on the paper where I want my center of interest to be. And then everything else fits on the paper around that. You don't start drawing all the other extraneous stuff in. You begin with the center of interest, and then everything else fits in there to make the center of interest work. So we're going to go ahead, and I'm going to show you how to quickly do a very, very quick sketch. And I am going to, as I say, 2 minutes. And I might even leave parts of this out here, and even move some things around. I'm going to take this steeple that's right here, and let's move it over a little bit more to improve the composition some. Really, all you're doing is laying in the shapes. and you will end up drawing with the brush when you get started. Okay, that's it. That's all the time you need to spend in sketching the subject. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and start, and when I do the direct painting, I don't worry too much about whether or not these are staining colors or sedimentary colors or whatever, because I'm only usually going to go over this once. I'm not going to try and do this in layers. So what I do with my studio paintings and what I do on this, two totally different things. Okay, in this case, you really don't need to worry too much about staying within the lines either. I'm going to work here. Typically, I end up working with doing the sky first. But the thing that I like to try and mention to people is just because the sky is blue and the grass is green that you can't vary some of the colors in there. So you want to mix things up a little bit. And as you can see here, I'm going beyond where the sky is. These are the distant hill ranges here, but I don't care whether the sky goes down over that or not. You don't have time to worry about that. You're going to paint over these later. And these buildings down here, the white parts of the buildings, that's the simple thing that you do. You just paint around them, and literally you're going to create those by painting around them and then bringing the shapes out. Some of these areas I may paint back wet into wet, I may paint wet into dry, depending on what I'm trying to do at the time. And as you can see, I am frequently changing my colors around. Don't stick with one color. I will put this down and gradually build up my darks. And the other thing, which you've probably heard over and over and over again, use the biggest brush you can for as long as you can. And you will find that the quicker you work, the better your subject usually turns out. Frequently I find that the ones that I've done in the shortest period of time turn out the best. Also, you also find out many times that the colors will dry on you and lighten up, especially if you're working wet. So you do have to push more pigment, more colors than you think you might otherwise. And as one of the instructors I had many years ago said, make your brush dance. Don't get too picky. Use the biggest brush you can for as long as you can. Part of what you also have to do is sometimes the paper gets so wet that you cannot do the pen and ink on it right away. So sometimes the thing that takes the longest is that perhaps you may have to wait on the pigment to dry a little bit before you can do the pen and ink over it. I had some paintings that I've done that will perhaps you wouldn't even recognize until I put the pen and ink on it what it really was. There comes a time where you have to sort of check your paper and see how wet it is before you can go any further. Now, I'm working on getting most of this background in. Some of this I will come back into in a minute. I'm going to go ahead and start working on bringing out some of these features here. And in this case, we're going to make sure we have a light source that's consistent. In this case, the lighting is coming from this direction here, so we will be making sure that we keep the shadowing on the right side to help emphasize this. Now, one of the things too many people get involved in wanting to immediately wipe off they think they put too much pigment in. It's going to dry lighter, so don't get into trying to figure out we'll keep wiping it off. You're wasting pigment and losing time. In this case, I'm making up some of this totally different than what's on this, just to simplify it even more. Check the and it doesn't hurt to let some of this pigment run together. It helps build up some of your shadows. So we're now at a point where I can bring some of these shapes of these buildings out and the shape of the trees by bringing out the changes in this. And I've got to let that dry a little bit, and I'll come back in here and start working on some of these other things. Part of what you do here is that you have to do the timing of making sure some areas are dry before you proceed on to the rest of it. Okay. Now, a lot of these I still have to come back in here as this dries and still build up some of these things a little bit more. You'll see what I'm doing here is I'm gradually building up and creating some shapes here that bring out one tree against the other, one building against the other. Come down in here and work on this shoreline while it's still wet. You notice I don't just take down here and make a straight line. I'm jiggling this thing around, making it bounce around. While that's still wet, we'll come in here and create some of the reflections of the trees and all in here. That you still have to do while it is still wet. Come back in here once I get some of those building reflections, tree reflections. I'll come back in there and add some of the, perhaps the water reflections back in there. Now, I'm repeating some of this reddish, purplish color in here as more or less reflections off of this bridge. If it's not there, you can still make it up. The other thing about doing your plein air journaling is that you do not have to put everything in there that's in front of you. You certainly can very easily leave things out, put things in that may not be there to improve your painting. I'm still working with this while this is still somewhat wet up in here. People always like to ask whenever somebody is doing a demo, what colors are you using? It's not really relevant. Use your favorite colors and just make sure that you are paying attention to your value changes and make interesting shapes. And if you do that, your painting will work. Okay, this is still not quite completely dry yet, but I'm coming back in and pushing color some more. I'm leaving some areas where it's hard edge and some edges where I'll soften. And you see, I keep changing colors periodically here. Maybe even throw in some that are maybe even exaggerated. Now I'm going to leave the top of this bridge where it's dark against a light background so that shows up. Here again, your value changes. Lights next to darks. Now, the further you get away with these hillsides, the lighter they are and the less defined. I will come back in later where I have natural divisions of where some of the paint has dried and use that to emphasis with the using the pen and ink. Some of these areas I'll come back in here and touch into them so that they soften and blend a little bit. Always remembering that these colors are going to dry lighter than when you put them down, especially if you're working wet. So don't be afraid to put the pigment down. Here, since this paint is dry here, I can work in a little bit closer to it. I'll come back in here and bring this tree out a little bit, making it re-wet it. And bring this tree back out here a little bit again. Okay. Bring the edge of that hillside out a little bit more. We may emphasize that some with some pen and ink a little bit later. Okay. I've kind of lost this down here. I have to let that dry. I'll come back in here and redefine that a little bit. In the meantime, I'm going to come back over here and work on this some. And with a lot of these pigments that I use in the direct painting, they are fairly sedimentary, and they will, you can come back in there after it's dried and touch these and lift it back up with no problem. Okay. Now we'll go back into defining this a little bit more. When you're doing architecture, usually use some eaves and some overhangs. That gives it a little bit more definition. It usually works very nicely that way. Comes to windows, you don't need anything but just a slight mark there, if even that. On this side of the steeple, I make it just a very light color there to show that the light's coming from that side. This is a little wet here still, so sometimes you have to just test this and see if it's too wet to paint back over. We may have to let that one go a little bit. Okay. At this point in time, I might come back in here and start doing some pen and ink on some of the areas that are dry enough. When I mentioned the type of ink that I like to use, or the pen that I like to use, one reason I like it is because the Statler pens, you can actually will still work quite well on damp paper, and very few of these other pens will. We have a choice of between a 0.3 and a 0.5. I'm going to go ahead and do the 0.5 here first. And one of the things I do when you got these church steeples is just try to cross on the top. Here's where you can put just enough definition in there in some of these things that helps to, you can create some of the direction of the tiles on the roof, for example. Here where the red paint got away from me a little bit, doesn't make any difference. We'll come back in here and just recreate that, and that brings your shape out a little bit. You can add a little bit more interest to the colors that you put in here to make it look like a window. And I'm going to go back to on this, and we're going to bring back out the tree a little bit. On your normal painting, studio paintings, you're not going to be outlining things like this, but to save time, you can see I'm working in this where a lot of this is still quite wet, but it is the pen is allowing me to still lightly apply this. Now I'm following sort of just the natural divisions of where my colors and shapes have to maybe just do a little bit of this. Here, that's almost dry. We may come back into this here. This is the point at which you can just you're not sitting here trying to waste a lot of time trying to do every bridge railing on here. It's not necessary. And you don't want to overdo the pen and the ink. Things like this, you might just put the semblance of some ripples in the water. Okay, now that ink is dried. The ink will dry fairly fast. I'm going to come back in here, and literally the finishing touch on this is just going to be to come back in here and go a little bit darker on this again to bring that out. I want to increase the value change on the bottom of this bridge somewhat so that it reads against the background, which is in highlight. Maybe do some things that here look like your limbs of your trees randomly. Okay, that's pretty much it. And you can see this is, you want to try and do this as quickly as possible. Just catch the main gist of what you're looking at. But the most important thing when you do this is how and where you put on your paper. You cannot spend forever trying to decide on where your subject matter goes on the paper because you don't have the time. You have to compose this in your head. You're having to work with the center of interest. You're having to work with values, value changes, and interesting shapes. So if those things are not in there, make them up. I hope you've enjoyed it, and hope to see you again in the future.